June 25, 1959. Columbia Records' 30th Street studio in New York City. The same room where just 3 months earlier, Miles Davis recorded Kind of Blue, destined to become the best-selling jazz album of all time. But today, something different is happening, something that shouldn't work. Dave Brubeck, a 38-year-old pianist wearing thick glasses and a conservative suit, sits at the piano with his quartet. For 40 minutes, they've been attempting the same song, over and over. 20 attempts, 21, 22. Producer Teo Macero finally stops the session. Someone keeps losing the beat. The song is in 5/4 time, 5 beats per measure instead of the standard 4. It sounds lopsided, wrong, like a mathematical equation that doesn't balance. Paul Desmond, the quartet's saxophonist, considers the tune a throwaway. He'd later joke he was ready to trade all rights to it for a used electric razor. That throwaway song was Take 5. Within 2 years, it would become the best-selling jazz single of all time. The album it appeared on, Time Out, would become the first jazz record to sell 1 million copies, then 2 million, then keep selling for 65 years and counting. But on that June afternoon, nobody in the studio believed they were making history. They were just trying to play in time signatures that, according to conventional wisdom, would never work in jazz. This is the story of an album that broke every rule, compositional, commercial, and racial. An album Columbia Records didn't want to release. An album critics initially dismissed. An album that came from Turkish street musicians, Indian drum patterns, and a cattle ranch in California where a young boy listened to the rhythm of farm equipment. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is the story of Dave Brubeck's Time Out, the 5/4 time signature hit nobody expected. To understand why Dave Brubeck heard rhythm differently, you have to go back to where it started, a cattle ranch in Ione, California, in the 1920s. Brubeck's father, Peter, was a cattle rancher. His mother, Elizabeth, had studied piano in England under the renowned Myra Hess and dreamed of becoming a concert pianist. Instead, she ended up on a ranch in rural California, teaching piano for extra money. Young Dave wasn't supposed to become a musician. His 2 older brothers were already on that path. Dave was expected to work the ranch. But something happened out there, alone on horseback, riding for miles across open country. Brubeck later explained, "If you're alone and just riding miles and miles with just nothing but you and your horse and the horse going along at a steady gait, I would start thinking of rhythms that I could hear from the horse's hooves. I could hear how to put a different beat against that." The cross rhythms of farm machinery fascinated him. Wheels turning at different speeds, equipment moving in patterns that didn't match. While other kids heard noise, Brubeck heard polyrhythm, multiple rhythms happening simultaneously. His mother recognized his gift and insisted he study music. But Brubeck had a secret. He couldn't read music fluently. His eyesight was poor, and he'd learned to play by ear, memorizing everything. When he enrolled at the College of the Pacific, the music department nearly expelled him when they discovered his deficiency. A zoology professor intervened, arguing that Brubeck had a rare gift that shouldn't be wasted over technicalities. The music department relented, on the condition that Brubeck never teach piano. After serving in World War II, where he formed one of the Army's first racially integrated bands, Brubeck studied with the legendary French composer Darius Milhaud at Mills College. Milhaud introduced him to the concept of polytonality and unusual time signatures in classical music. But it would be years before Brubeck fully explored these ideas in jazz. By 1951, Brubeck had formed the Dave Brubeck Quartet. Their early recordings featured time experiments, but by the mid-1950s, he'd mostly settled into standard jazz fare, 4/4 and 3/04 time standards and show tunes. Then came 1954. Brubeck appeared on the cover of Time magazine, only the second jazz musician after Louis Armstrong to receive that honor. The article called him the leader of the birth of a new kind of jazz age in the U.S. But Brubeck was uncomfortable with the fame. He believed he'd only received such mainstream acceptance because he was white, while more talented black musicians like Duke Ellington were overlooked. The guilt would shape his decisions for the rest of his career. By 1956, Brubeck had been playing with alto saxophonist Paul Desmond since the late 1940s. Their partnership was so crucial that Desmond's contract included a clause: he couldn't record with another pianist on his own albums. Every Desmond solo record would feature a guitarist instead. Desmond's sound was distinctive. Dry, witty, almost conversational. His tone has been described as sounding like a dry martini. He and Brubeck had an almost telepathic musical connection, finishing each other's musical sentences. But the rhythm section hadn't clicked yet. Then came drummer Joe Morello. In 1956, Morello was working with pianist Marian McPartland. She remembered first meeting him. He was wearing thick glasses and looked less like a drummer than a student of nuclear physics. But when he played, everyone in the room realized that the guy with the diffident air was a phenomenal drummer. Morello had originally studied violin and had a classical background that gave him facility with complex rhythms. But he was initially unimpressed with the Brubeck Quartet. He'd seen them at Birdland in New York and recalled, "I just see Dave and Paul with 2 spotlights. I said, I don't want to sit in the dark." The previous drummer hadn't played a 4-bar break in 3 years. Paul just wanted him to play railroad tracks, straight. But Brubeck convinced Morello to join for a temporary 2-month tour in 1955. Morello quickly realized Brubeck's vision was different. Brubeck later said, "I could tell that Morello wasn't going to come in and just be a timekeeper. He obviously could play those time signatures that I wanted to get into ever since the days of the octet." The final piece fell into place in 1958 when bassist Eugene Wright joined. Wright was African American, which would create enormous problems in the segregated South. But Brubeck refused to compromise. This was it, the classic quartet that would record "Time Out." Dave Brubeck on piano, Paul Desmond on alto saxophone, Eugene Wright on bass, and Joe Morello on drums. In 1958, the U.S. State Department had an idea. Send American jazz musicians on goodwill tours to counter Soviet propaganda during the Cold War. Jazz would be America's secret weapon, proof of cultural freedom and racial harmony. The irony, of course, was thick. America was deeply segregated, and the State Department knew it. But on paper, integrated jazz quartets looked like racial progress. Brubeck joined Benny Goodman, Louis Armstrong, and Dizzy Gillespie in this jazz diplomacy program. The Dave Brubeck Quartet embarked on a 4-month tour through Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. 80 concerts in over 14 countries, including Poland, Turkey, Iraq, Afghanistan, India, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. The tour changed everything. In Turkey, Brubeck walked the streets of Istanbul and heard something that stopped him cold. Street musicians playing in a rhythm he'd never encountered in Western music. It was in 9/8 time, but not divided the usual way, 3 + 3 + 3. Instead, it was subdivided as 2 + 2 + 2 + 3, creating an asymmetrical, lopsided feel. Brubeck approached the musicians and asked where they'd learned the rhythm. One replied, "This rhythm is to us what the blues is to you." That sentence unlocked something in Brubeck's mind. The blues, the foundation of American jazz, came from African rhythms that white Americans had considered exotic or primitive. Why shouldn't he incorporate other world rhythms into jazz? He began composing a piece based on that Turkish rhythm, eventually calling it Blue Rondo alla Turk, a playful reference to Mozart's Rondo alla Turca, though Brubeck later regretted the name, feeling it confused people. In India, Morello experienced something equally transformative. He attended sessions at All India Radio where he encountered Indian musicians playing complex rhythmic patterns on the mridangam, a double-sided hand drum. The complexity of Indian rhythms, particularly the use of 5/4 and 7/4 time, fascinated Morello. Desmond noted in his diary, "Another session with Indian musicians at All India Radio. Pretty much a mutual admiration society for rhythm men." Morello began incorporating 5/4 patterns into his solos during the group's performances of Sounds of the Loop. Audiences were confused but intrigued. Morello kept asking Brubeck, "Why don't you write something in 5/4? By the time the quartet returned to America, Brubeck had decided his next album would be entirely in unusual time signatures, not as a gimmick but as a serious musical exploration. Columbia Records had other ideas. When Brubeck pitched his concept to Columbia, the label's executives were horrified. An entire album of original compositions in odd time signatures? No standards? No familiar melodies? Brubeck later recalled, "I had a painting on the cover, and that hadn't happened in jazz. And also it was all originals, and they were against that. If you did all original compositions, you usually couldn't do that. They wanted you to do standard Broadway shows and standard tunes from the love songs of the day." Columbia saw Brubeck as a proven commodity. His college concert albums had sold well, and his clean-cut image made him palatable to mainstream white audiences. Why risk that with experimental music? But Brubeck had one crucial ally: Columbia president Goddard Lieberson. Unlike the business executives, Lieberson was a composer and arranger himself. He understood what Brubeck was trying to do. Lieberson made Brubeck a deal. Record one safe album first, a collection of standards that would act as insurance if the experimental album flopped. Then Columbia would fund the unusual time signature project. In April 1959, Brubeck recorded Gone with the Wind, an album of songs from the American South including Old Man River, Georgia on My Mind, and Camptown Races. Critics hated it, calling it bland and uninspired. But it gave Columbia their safety net. Now Brubeck could make his dream album. The first session was scheduled for June 25, 1959, at Columbia's legendary 30th Street studio. The massive space, formerly a church, had incredible natural acoustics. Producer Teo Macero, just beginning his illustrious career, would oversee the sessions. The plan was to complete the album in one day. But the complexity of the material made that impossible. It would take 3 sessions, June 25th, July 1st, and August 18th. And that first day, with Take 5, almost didn't happen at all. The song that would define the album and Brubeck's entire career came about almost by accident. Morello had been soloing in 5/4 time during concerts, and he kept pestering Brubeck to write something formal in that time signature. But Brubeck was busy composing other tracks, so he delegated the task to Desmond. Desmond later explained his approach. "I still think basically it was a dubious idea at best. But at that point we had 3 or 4 albums a year to get done. Dave said, 'Why don't we do this album and do all different time signatures?' And I said, 'Okay.' I was always argumentative. And for some reason I lucked out. It was sort of like Keno. 'Okay, we've got 2/4, 3/4, 5/4, 6/4, 7/4, 8/4, whatever. Why don't you take 5/4? And I wrote Take 5. Desmond composed 2 melodic themes but couldn't figure out how to structure them into a complete song. Brubeck took Desmond's fragments and arranged them in ABBA form, a classic pop song structure. The title Take 5 worked on 2 levels. It referenced the 5/4 time signature and the colloquial phrase meaning, take a 5-minute break. Desmond wasn't happy with the title. He didn't think anyone would understand it. Brubeck persisted. I said, "Paul, you're the only person probably in the country that doesn't know what it means." When they attempted to record it on June 25th, disaster struck. For 40 minutes, the quartet tried take after take. Someone kept losing the beat. The early version had a driving and fast feel with a lopsided Latin rhythm that wasn't working. After more than 20 failed attempts, Teo Macero called a halt. They'd have to try again another day. 6 days later, on July 1st, they returned with a slightly altered arrangement. The new version had what musicians would later describe as a sexy 5/4 take 5 beat that sits in the groove, more laid back and hypnotic. They nailed it in 2 takes. But nobody thought it was special. Desmond called it a throwaway and joked he'd been ready to trade all rights to the song for a used Ronson electric razor. 4 days later, on July 5th, the quartet performed Take 5 for the first time before a live audience at the Newport Jazz Festival. The response was polite but hardly overwhelming. While Take 5 would eventually define the album, Brubeck always considered Blue Rondo à la Turque the artistic centerpiece. The opening track announces immediately that this won't be ordinary jazz. The 9/8 rhythm, 2+2+2 postiri, has an urgent, caffeinated energy, like Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue colliding with Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. For 90 seconds, Brubeck and Desmond trade increasingly intense solos in this asymmetrical rhythm, building to a climax that sounds like it might explode. Then, suddenly, it evaporates into lazy 4/4 swing. Desmond plays a relaxed blues solo while Wright walks the bass line in standard time. Just when you've adjusted to the conventional jazz, the 9/8 theme crashes back in. The constant shifting between time signatures and moods makes Blue Rondo intellectually stimulating but also slightly disorienting, like a car radio caught between stations. Strange Meadowlark, the album's only track in straight 4/4 time, provides breathing room. Brubeck wrote it inspired by the call of the western meadowlark he'd heard on his California ranch. His wife Iola later added lyrics, which Carmen McRae would record with the quartet in 1960. 3 to Get Ready starts as a simple waltz, 3/4 time, before vacillating between 2 bars of 3/4 and 2 bars of 4/4. The pattern suits Brubeck's piano style perfectly. He thrived in polyrhythmic environments. Kathy's Waltz, named after Brubeck's 5-year-old daughter Kathy but misspelled by Columbia, starts in 4/4 before switching to 3/4 and then merging both. Music critic Spencer Lee later speculated it inspired Paul McCartney's All My Loving, which shares similar rhythmic patterns. Everybody's Jumpin' and Pickup Sticks both explore 6/4 time in different ways. Pickup Sticks features a 6-note bass ostinato that repeats 99 consecutive times, a hypnotic foundation that should feel monotonous but somehow doesn't. The technical achievement of Time Out is staggering, but Brubeck and his quartet never let the mathematics overwhelm the music. Every track grooves, swings, and feels natural despite the unusual meters. One crucial element distinguished Time Out from typical jazz albums: the cover art. Columbia's art director S. Neil Fujita created an abstract painting specifically for the album. This was revolutionary. Most jazz albums featured either photos of the musicians or generic illustrations. Fujita's background made him the perfect artist for this project. Born in Hawaii to Japanese immigrant parents, he'd been forcibly relocated to a Wyoming internment camp during World War II. After enlisting in the 442nd Infantry Regiment, the most decorated unit in U.S. military history, he'd served in Europe and later worked as a translator in Okinawa. After the war, Fujita studied at the Chouinard Art Institute and joined Columbia Records in 1954. He was the first to commission painters, photographers, and illustrators for album covers, introducing abstract expressionism to jazz packaging. For Time Out, Fujita created a painting influenced by Picasso's Les Femmes d'Alger, geometric shapes and blocks of color that somehow captured the album's experimental spirit. Fujita later explained, "Somebody said that the group was returning from a tour of Asia. I had recently returned from the service with Armed Forces Intelligence in the Western Pacific, so I borrowed some colors and shapes that seemed to go with the mood. The cover was abstract art meeting jazz at its most innovative, visual polyrhythm matching musical polyrhythm. Brubeck had originally wanted to use a Joan Miro painting, but Columbia couldn't secure permission. That Miro painting would eventually grace Time Further Out in 1961. Time Out was released on December 14, 1959. Columbia's promotion was minimal. They had no faith in the commercial potential of an experimental jazz album. A promotional single featuring the full version of Take 5 was released in September 1959. It went nowhere. Columbia also pressed Take 5 and Blue Rondo a la Turque as part of their doomed launch of stereo 7-inch singles, a format that never caught on. Critics were lukewarm to hostile. Some praised the musicianship but questioned the concept. Others dismissed it as a gimmick. Jazz purists accused Brubeck of abandoning swing in favor of academic exercises. The album sold respectably but not spectacularly. For several months, Time Out seemed destined to be an interesting footnote, a noble experiment that failed commercially. Then something unexpected happened. Disc jockeys started playing it. Without corporate promotion, individual DJs, particularly in Cleveland and Chicago, discovered Take 5 and put it into heavy rotation. One station in New York, WNEW, played it constantly. Listeners called in requesting the song, and requesting it again. And again. The groundswell was grassroots, driven by college students and young adults who found something irresistible in that hypnotic 5/4 groove. The song had a cool, sophisticated feel, jazz that felt modern without being threatening. By late 1960, Columbia realized they'd missed something. They prepared a radio-friendly edit of Take 5 for proper single release, shorter with less of Morello's drum solo. In May 1961, the edited version was reissued. This time, it exploded. On October 9, 1961, Take 5 peaked at number 25 on the Billboard Hot 100. Extraordinary for a jazz instrumental, it reached number 5 on the Easy Listening chart and number 6 in the UK. Eventually, it became the best-selling jazz single of all time, with over 2 million copies sold. The album followed suit. On November 27, 1961, Time Out peaked at number 2 on the Billboard Albums chart, kept from the top spot only by Judy Garland's Judy at Carnegie Hall. Time Out spent 164 weeks on the Billboard chart, over 3 years. By 1963, it had sold 500,000 copies, earning gold record status. It became the first jazz album to sell 1 million copies. Columbia Records executives were stunned. The experimental album they'd reluctantly released, only after Brubeck recorded an insurance policy, had become the best-selling jazz album ever made. The businessmen who'd fought against releasing it now accused Brubeck of going commercial. The irony wasn't lost on him. While Time Out was climbing the charts, the Dave Brubeck Quartet was fighting a different battle, America's racial segregation. The quartet was integrated. Eugene Wright, the bassist, was black. In the North and West, this was rarely an issue. But when they toured the South, they encountered fierce resistance. College promoters and venue owners demanded Brubeck replace Wright with a white bassist. Some wouldn't allow Wright on stage. Others insisted he stay out of sight, off camera if they were being filmed, hidden in shadows during performances. Brubeck's response was consistent and uncompromising. No. The quartet performed as 4 equals, or they didn't perform at all. In January 1960, Brubeck canceled a 25-day tour of Southern colleges and universities after 22 schools refused to allow Wright to perform. The lost revenue was substantial, but Brubeck never wavered. When a television appearance on the Bell Telephone Hour was scheduled, producers informed Brubeck that Wright would be kept off camera. Brubeck canceled the appearance. This stance came at real financial cost. But Brubeck felt deeply that his success as a white musician, appearing on the Time magazine cover before more talented black artists like Duke Ellington, came with responsibility. Morello later recalled, Brubeck said, "I formed this band and we're going to stay together. If they don't want Eugene, we're not going to play. And we lost a lot of money by not playing certain places." The irony was thick. Columbia Records had initially forced Brubeck to record Gone with the Wind, an album of songs from the American South, before allowing Time Out. That safe album was meant to appeal to Southern audiences who would later refuse to see the quartet perform because of Wright's presence. In August 1959, something happened that gave Brubeck crucial validation at a moment of doubt. The Music Inn, a venue in the Berkshires region of Massachusetts, hosted a jazz roundtable, a series of discussions about music founded by Professor Marshall Stearns. Dr. Willis James, an authority on African folk songs, performed an African chant for the audience, which included many notable jazz musicians. After finishing, James asked, "Can any of you tell me what time signature that was in?" Silence. James continued, "That was an American work song. It was in 5/4 time, and the Dave Brubeck Quartet is on the right track." Brubeck, who was in the audience, was elated. Years later, he still called it, "my big moment of glory." James explained, "If you go back to the field hollers, they go right back to Africa. Why shouldn't you be doing what you're doing? It's in the tradition of Africa to play in complicated time signatures." This endorsement from a respected scholar legitimized what Brubeck was attempting. Unusual time signatures weren't a white musician's gimmick. They connected to the African roots of jazz itself. Time Out spawned 3 immediate sequels: Time Further Out, 1961, Countdown, Time in Outer Space, 1962, and Time Changes, 1964. Each continued exploring unusual time signatures. Time Further Out reached number 8 on the Billboard 200 and featured Unsquare Dance in 7/4 time, which became another minor hit, but none matched the cultural impact of the original. The influence of Time Out spread far beyond jazz. Rock musicians like Keith Emerson, of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, adapted Blue Rondo a la Turk, playing it in 4/4 time. When Emerson met Brubeck years later, Brubeck joked, "Your 4/4 version, which I can't play," though of course he could have. Progressive rock bands like Yes and Rush incorporated unusual time signatures into their music, citing Brubeck as an influence. In the 1970s, fusion artists like Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea continued experimenting with rhythm in ways Time Out had pioneered. The album's commercial success proved that artistic ambition and popular appeal weren't mutually exclusive. Jazz didn't have to choose between innovation and accessibility. In 1997, Time Out was remastered for CD and certified platinum. In 2009, it was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. The same year, Columbia Legacy released a 3-disc 50th anniversary edition featuring alternate takes and live performances. In 2005, the Library of Congress added Time Out to the National Recording Registry, recognizing it as culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. In 2011, the album was certified double platinum, confirming sales of over 2 million copies, extraordinary for any jazz album. In 2020, Dave Brubeck's sons, Chris, Darius, and Dan, released Time Outtakes on their family label, Brubeck Editions. The album featured alternate takes from the original 1959 sessions that had been discovered in their father's archives. Chris Brubeck described his reaction. "Hearing this stuff for me was like pirates discovering a chest full of doubloons. And I sincerely think that some of the takes that were discarded are better than what was on Time Out." The alternate Blue Rondo a la Turk is longer, with Brubeck playing 10 blues choruses instead of 4. Chris noted, "The way he keeps referencing back to the main theme and then making it polytonal and displacing it rhythmically is so great. It's very compositionally integrated." The alternate Take 5 revealed surprising differences. The tempo is slightly faster, and Morello's drum solo is completely different, more technically complex but arguably less effective than the lyrical, spacious solo that appeared on the released version. Studio banter captured at the end of the alternate Take 5 revealed that even Morello, one of the most technically accomplished drummers in jazz, couldn't remember how to coordinate his limbs to play the complicated beat he'd invented. "Joe was a supremely technical drummer," Chris said. "So I never actually heard of a situation where he didn't know exactly what he was doing." These outtakes provided a window into the creative process. The quartet working through ideas, producer Teo Matero offering guidance, decisions being made about what worked and what didn't. Dave Brubeck continued performing until shortly before his death on December 5, 2012. One day before his 92nd birthday, he was en route to a cardiology appointment when his heart finally gave out. News of his death rekindled interest in Time Out and Take 5. The single re-entered charts across Europe. In Austria, it debuted at 73, in France, 48, in the Netherlands, U50. A new generation discovered the music. Paul Desmond had died much earlier, in 1977, from lung cancer at age 52. In his will, he left all performance royalties from his compositions, including Take 5, to the American Red Cross. The charity has received over $100,000 annually from that one song. Joe Morello, who'd gone blind in 1976, spent his later years teaching rather than performing. His students included Max Weinberg, Bruce Springsteen's drummer, John Fishman, Fish, and Tico Torres, Bon Jovi. Morello died in 2011 at age 82. Eugene Wright, who'd faced discrimination with quiet dignity, outlived them all, passing away in 2020 at age 97. Teo Macero went on to produce hundreds of albums for Columbia, including Miles Davis's Bitches Brew and Thelonious Monk's Monk's Dream. He died in 2008. S. Neil Fujita left Columbia in 1960 to establish his own design firm. He designed iconic book covers including In Cold Blood and The Godfather. He died in 2010 at age 89. On December 14, 2024, Time Out will turn 65 years old. It remains in print, still selling, still inspiring musicians. The album's story is one of artistic courage rewarded, but also of fortunate accidents. If Joe Morello hadn't studied violin first and learned complex time signatures, if the 1958 State Department tour hadn't taken the quartet to Turkey and India, if Paul Desmond hadn't agreed to write something in 5/4, even though he thought it was a dubious idea, if Goddard Lieberson hadn't championed the project at Columbia, any one of these factors missing, and Time Out doesn't exist. But the deeper story is about what happens when you trust your artistic vision even when the industry tells you it won't work. When you refuse to compromise on principles even when it costs you money. When you take risks because the alternative, playing it safe, would be a betrayal of everything music should be. Time Out proved that complexity can be catchy, that 5 beats can groove just as hard as 4, that innovation and popularity aren't enemies. 65 years later, Take 5 still sounds fresh. Blue Rondo a la Turk still surprises. And somewhere, a young musician is hearing unusual time signatures for the first time, and realizing that the rules they'd been taught aren't rules at all. They're just conventions waiting to be broken. That 8-month pregnant woman lying on a studio floor, confused critics, record executives who wanted safe music, Turkish street musicians playing in 9/8, Indian drummers playing in 5/4, a cattle rancher's son who heard cross rhythms in farm equipment, all of it led to one perfect accident. The jazz album that broke every rule and sold 1 million copies. This has been The Sound Vault. Every album has a story, and some stories, like Dave Brubeck's, remind us that the impossible is just the possible that nobody's tried yet.